earlier this evening, not long earlier this evening, in Chicago. What happened here is that Donald Trump has had a series of rallies, a series of events in which there have been violent altercations with protesters at the events. And I mean this in a very specific way. I feel like this is being described as if it's some abstract or sort of inchoate or hard to describe phenomenon. It's been very specific. If you start at the beginning of Mr. Trump's campaign, when he first announced that he was running for president, you may remember that announcement speech was when he decided to riff on his ideas about Mexican immigrants and say that Mexican immigrants were criminals and rapists. When you start off your presidential campaign that way, some people are going to be offended and people are going to protest when you show up to speak. That only became more evident when Mr. Trump then started proposing things like banning all Muslims from the United States. When you propose something like that, not just Muslim Americans, but lots of people are going to see you as a different kind of politician and are going to show up to protest when you speak in public. That was the basic starting point of where this started. The next phase of that is that when protesters started turning out to go to Mr. Trump's events, there was a decision made by the campaign as to how they would deal with those protests. I mean, we've all seen protests. We've all seen hecklers. We've all seen more or less organized interruptions of public officials and politicians, national level politicians, you know, at their events, up to and including the President of the United States, presidents of multiple parties over multiple years. And you see how politicians deal with it. The Trump campaign made a decision about how they were going to deal with disruptive protests that were absolutely predictable and fairly run-of-the-mill once Mr. Trump started running for president and saying the kind of provocative things that he said. The way they decided to deal with those protesters was by making a political spectacle of both the protest and the way the Trump campaign and his supporters responded to them. And so lots of politicians have to confront protesters. I don't know of any other national caliber, national level politician who would respond to protesters by every time, always and every single time, bringing their event to a halt, drawing everybody in the room's attention to the protester. Once it started happening at a systematic level in the Trump campaign, they started running a standard public service announcement at the start of their events, telling people how they wanted the crowd to respond when there was a protester inevitably at that event. Mr. Trump then started yelling from the stage at the protesters who were being taken out of his rallies, right? So the public service announcement would come out and there'd be a big-voiced guy, a voice of God announcer who would say something like, if there is a disruption to Mr. Trump's event tonight, please raise your signs in the air and shout Trump, 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 Trump to drown this person out, and then security will take them out. So that became something that they planned on happening at every event. Then Mr. Trump started talking about it from the podium. He started talking about it from the podium, and he started shouting, you can say it with me now, get him out. Get him out has become enough of a Trump tagline right now that it competes with you're fired, which was the tagline from his reality show. People actually turn up to Trump rallies now with signs that say, get him out. The way that Mr. Trump does sort of call and response with his audiences now, where he says, who's going to pay for the wall? And the crowd shouts back, Mexico. One of the other things that they shout now on their own before he's even had a chance to do it is, get him out, get him out. They like that he screams that at people, and that's become another one of his catchphrases. So get him out, get the protesters out. It is something where it's usually security getting people out. But we have had incidents, stray incidents here and there dating all the way back to October in which it wasn't just security taking the protesters out. It was Trump supporters taking it upon themselves to punch and kick and shove and scream at the protesters either before security got to them or as security was taking them out of the room. It started off here and there. There was one that we know of in October. There was one or two that we know of in November. Happened episodically that in addition to people getting taken out and Trump screaming, get them out, you would also have Trump supporters essentially physically pounce on that person. You remember the footage from Birmingham, Alabama, right? I think that one was in November, where the guy's on the ground. It's an African-American man on the ground. He'd been screaming in a sort of Black Lives Matter protest, and a group of white men surrounding him, kicking him and hitting him until they can get him out. You remember that, right? You remember the footage just from a week or so ago from Louisville, Kentucky, where the young black woman is standing holding a sign at the beginning, at the front of the room, and a group of grown white men start screaming at her and shoving her. And what she says happened is that they were screaming the N-word at her and the C-word at her, and they're full-on shoving her to try to sort of get her out of the room, but also to take their physical abuse. And once that sort of thing started happening, not just here and there, but pretty regularly at Mr. Trump's rallies, he upped his game from the podium in terms of the way he talks about those instances of violence among his own supporters. He starts getting critical press coverage for the fact that there are incidents of violence at his events. He starts criticizing the press for being too politically correct. He starts talking about how in the good old days, you know what? A protester like that would be brought out of here on a stretcher. He says, you know what? I'd like to punch him in the face. He starts saying to his supporters, don't hurt him, don't hurt him. You know what? If you do hurt him, I'll cover your legal fees. If somebody's going to throw tomatoes from this crowd, just grab them. Kick the bleep out of them, he says from the podium. And the crowd roars in anticipation. This week in Fayetteville, North Carolina, it escalated to the point where a young man who was being escorted out of a rally, he was a protester, he was a loud protester, he was being escorted out of the rally by sheriff's deputies. Sheriff deputies were looking the other direction, and a man came out of the crowd and threw a sucker punch elbow right in the face of the young man who was being taken out of the room. That man, the Trump protester, threw the elbow. He was arrested not that night, but the next day after video circulated of the incident taken from multiple cell phone cameras. Mr. Trump spent today, not directly, but indirectly and obviously, justifying what that guy did. Talking about how that man's anger was legitimate and how we're a weak country for criticizing people for doing this sort of thing, which you ought to expect. Donald Trump has changed the political atmosphere around himself on purpose. Protesters didn't turn Donald Trump events violent. There was an inevitability of protest at Donald Trump events. There's an inevitability of some level of protest at all political events. What Donald Trump did was turn it into part of his political character, part of the political theater of his events, in a way that has made his crowds more and more bloodthirsty. He needs to say things that are more and more, in his words, politically incorrect. In this case, on this issue, it means pushing more and more towards direct incitement of violence. Today in St. Louis, as protester after protester after protester was getting hauled out of the room, and Mr. Trump's event in St. Louis today effectively stopped, so that all he was talking about was the protests. All he was talking about was the attitude toward the protesters and the weakness of the United States and the political correctness that didn't let us beat those people up anymore. As his rally in St. Louis today turned into that, Mr. Trump said in an aside, you know, they told me that I might want to cancel this today for security reasons. And I said, no, no, no. And the crowd went wild. No, you wouldn't cancel this for security reasons. In Chicago was his next stop. St. Louis this afternoon, Chicago tonight. In Chicago, the press, and certainly social media, but even the mainstream press, has been full in recent days of reports about how big the protests were going to be at this Donald Trump event tonight, right? I mean, take it back to the beginning. Where did the protests start against Donald Trump? They started when he said Mexican immigrants to this country are rapists and criminals. 30% of the city of Chicago is Latino. Yes, there's going to be protests at your event, right? The way that these events have been going, with protesters getting beat up and Mr. Trump basically encouraging that from the podium, yeah, people were going to turn up to protest and tempers were going to be hot. And so there were a lot of people outside in the street. There were a lot of people ready to protest inside the room. Donald Trump was coming off of this St. Paul rally this afternoon where he said he'd been advised to cancel it, but no. The St. Louis rally, where he had been advised to cancel it, but no. And so they get all these people into the streets of Chicago, and they get somewhere between 7,000 and 10,000 people into this venue at the University of Illinois at Chicago. They're all in there. It's ready to go. It's ready to kick off. Everybody is waiting for a riot. And what do? They go to the podium and say, for security reasons, we're canceling this. Please go in peace. Literally, that was the phrase they used. Please go in peace. And so what do you think is going to happen? So they left 7,000 to 10,000 people amped up, ready for the kinds of fights that Donald Trump has been asking for at his events. and then they said, leave. And so, yeah, now we've got American presidential politics that includes big fistfights and riots ready to happen, and thousands of people milling around and everybody wondering when the blood is going to start flowing. Now this is American presidential politics. This didn't come out of nowhere. This isn't a product of people being angry about economic circumstances or anything else in the country. This is mobs of people in an emotionally electric environment being spurred to violence by the person at the front of the room who has the microphone. This is a different thing. This is not the American character at work. This is a political campaign at work. We're going to turn around some of the interview that Mr. Trump just did live with my colleague Chris Matthews on the phone, especially the part in which Mr. Trump said that he thinks this will be good for him, that this footage, these images will be good for him. He thinks this will help his campaign. In his mind, he's being credited this evening with having been the big man, with having been the cool head in calling this thing off. Let the record show that this is the way they called it off. We haven't seen American political violence at the center of American politics in my lifetime. And I'm old. I mean, there's always been a level of violence on the edges of American political extremism. That's always happened. But when it's a major city rally for the front-running Republican presidential contender, and you can see the violence coming a mile away, I mean, we canceled segments for the show that we had planned to do between 9 and 10 live tonight. We canceled them in advance before this rally started, when we saw what was happening in the streets outside this event, and we saw what Donald Trump had done to incite violence, and I'm saying that deliberately, to incite violence from his event earlier today in St. Louis. When we saw how he was amping people up and egging them on and all but asking for violence from his supporters against any protesters who might turn up, when he took this turn today to saying that protesters at his events are destroying America, when he started talking about protesters at his events that way, telling his supporters, oh, I wish we could go back to the good old days when you know how these guys would have been treated. These people are destroying America. These are bad people. When we saw him take that rhetorical turn today, and we saw the number of people who wanted to protest him in Chicago today, we could see it coming. It's not an accident, right? This isn't subtle. This is politics at the top of the Republican Party. This is who they're going to nominate for president. This is not normal in our country, but this is politics. This is a political campaign.